Sustainable Sydney 2030 was something that was consulted back in sort of 2006 and ran over about 2 years. It was the largest consultation that the city had ever undertaken by far, and 97% of respondents said they wanted urgent action on climate change. So this is what's driven the political agenda on Sustainable Sydney 2030. That all happened before I came over here. In fact, they'd already agreed that. But basically, they were quite honest and say, we've got this wonderful strategy plan, but we don't know how to deliver it. And so that's basically why I came over here, to actually deliver that. If you're wondering why we've got two Earths, well, the small Earth is the planet that we're living on, and the large Earth is the planets whose resources we're consuming, which will pretty much run out before the end of the century, quite apart from climate change. It's a typical coal-fired power station, 1,000 megawatts, generates 1 million kilowatt hours of electricity per hour, and rejects more than 2 million kilowatt hours of heat per hour up into the atmosphere, using 5 million litres of water to do it. At the same time, it's emitting more than 1,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions per hour. So if you multiply that by the 8,760 hours that we have in a year, you get the picture for one power station. You multiply that by the number of power stations we have in Australia, or indeed the world, and you begin to see what the problem is. Now, the power stations that run Sydney predominantly are the coal-fired power stations in Hunter Valley. And they have an electrical efficiency of 28%. So 72% of primary energy is shoved up into the atmosphere before the electricity even gets into the grid. There's about 8.5% grid losses, so by the time it gets to Sydney, we've got about 25% of the primary energy burnt at the power station. And if you've still got those tungsten light bulbs at home, which are 10% light, 90% heat, you are consuming 2.5% of the 100% that's been generated to light your light bulb. When you see these levels of huge inefficiency, it not only hits on climate change, but a whole range of other areas. Now, this huge amount of inefficiency has to be paid for. And you and I have seen this in recent years with really swinging increases in electricity bills. And that's predominantly driven by network charges, shifting the electrons from the remote power stations into cities. In New South Wales alone, the 5-year determination period that we're currently in, which runs until next year, $18 billion is being spent on network upgrades, poles and wires. Across Australia as a whole, $46 billion. That's a lot more than a $34 billion national broadband network, but you never heard anybody talk about poles and wires at the last election. So at the beginning of the 5-year determination period, which is a thing that comes up every 5 years, most consumers don't know this at all, but this is when the regulator agrees what prices are going to be charged over the next 5 years. 40% of your electricity bill was network charges. At the moment, it's about 55%, and by the end of next year, 60% of your electricity bill will just be for poles and wires. Your carbon tax and all those other charges are relatively tiny compared to the network charges. Some work that was done by the University Technology Sydney calculated that just a modest amount of decentralised energy would reduce energy bills by about $600 million a year, and between $1.4 and $3.8 billion in capital investment, and reduce emissions by between 2.2 and 8.4 million tonnes per annum by 2020. So when looking at climate change, the city worked out that in order to comply with Kyoto, it needed to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions right across the local government area by 70% from 2006 levels by 2030. A key part of that is what we call the Green Infrastructure Plan. They had identified tri-generation and renewable energy, 100% local energy target, 70% from tri-generation, 30% from renewable energy, but also a 30% reduction in water demand and a switch over to recycled water. So what is tri-generation? Generating electricity here using more efficient units, but instead of throwing the heat away, that heat's captured and put into pipes and used to provide heating and hot water to buildings. For a further step, you use a technology that called heat-fired absorption cooling that converts the hot water to chilled water for air conditioning. Now, when looking at Sydney, there have been some examples of standalone systems, but these typically will deliver between 15 and 25% of a building's energy needs. Connecting buildings up together in a precinct, as they do elsewhere around the world, where you get the different balance loads from different types of uses during the day, during the week, during the year. And in Woking and the projects I did there, Woking and London, I was achieving 125 to 135%, which made the site self-sufficient, and we traded 25 to 35% between the island energy centres and didn't use the national grid at all. In Woking, within a period of 14 years, I reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 77.5%, and pretty much took 98% of Woking off the grid. There's 2% still to go, by using this method of using buildings connected together in closed precincts. So how do you start from scratch? I mean, Australia just doesn't have any experience of this whatsoever. I mean, the oldest system in the world is in Manhattan, in New York, first put in by Edison in 1878. And all the big cities around the world have these decentralised energy systems. The biggest one in the Asia-Pacific region is Seoul, capital of South Korea, and that supplies 2.5 million inhabitants with decentralised energy, and something like 1,600, 1,700 commercial and public sector buildings. So we needed to look at Sydney in a completely different way. So we took a master planning approach. So we invited the electricity and gas network operators into the project team, who have to be fair, were a bit resistant because they'd only been used to small-scale systems. And of course, small-scale systems will give the gas company severe problems in the coming years. We literally need to spend millions to reinforce the gas network, and small-scale projects just can't afford that. Similarly, on electricity, in order to avoid the huge costs that you get for connecting decentralised energy systems, you really need to connect into the 11 kV and 33 kV network to displace the remote electrons coming in at those points. So here, it really shows you where the energy is being consumed. The redder it is peak consumption. $11 billion of that $18 billion is for peak power for 40 hours a year, which everyone is paying for. And in the CBD, buildings there, between 50 and 70% of their electricity consumption is air conditioning. So what we did was unbundle all that work. So heating and hot water that was provided by gas to move over to thermal energy. More importantly, to displace electricity for air conditioning and refrigeration and move that across to thermal energy, the waste heat from local electricity generation. And that will make a substantial impact on reducing emissions. We were originally looking for 330 megawatts to achieve our targets, but the 3 CBD zones there showed 340 megawatts. We haven't assumed connecting the whole of the city, 65% commercial, 50% retail, and 30% residential, principally the high-rise tower blocks. And of course, Green Square, which the council's determined that's actually going to start out as a green development. So these are what large-scale systems look like. That's an absorption chiller that just sits there. There's no moving part. There's one small dilution pump that just converts hot water to chilled water. It's one of my precinct-scale systems in Woking. You quite often have to point out to people what they are. This one's bolted onto the side of a multi-storey car park. And of course, I was part of the London Olympics bidding team, and the 2 tri-generation stations that we have at the London Olympics and Stratford City are there because of that bid. That's essentially gave us the extra 1 or 2 points. London won it over Paris. Yes, we are talking about infrastructure, pipes in the ground, flow and return, and that provides a golden opportunity for a citywide recycled water network and an automated waste collection system. But how do you present to people greenhouse gas emissions? Because it's you can't see it, touch it, feel it, doesn't make a noise. So we kind of produce these 3D quasi-graphics to try and get the message across. The higher the towers, not a developer's dream, that's the annual energy consumption. And the redder it is the intensity or the peak consumption, so that those buildings that are really causing problems to the network. Buildings connecting to the tri-generation system will see their emissions reduced by between 40 and 60%, depending on how efficient the building is to start with. When we looked at government targets, the 20% renewable energy target, and all those things that federal and state governments said they were going to do, we found it would make, and against growth, it would only reduce emissions by about 4%, so nowhere near what we were looking for. Moving on to renewable energy, well, this will be published early next year, so I'm giving you a bit of an insight into what we've established. This shows us the resources in New South Wales. The blue corridor there is the sort of good onshore wind areas. The orange disc is solar thermal concentration or solar thermal power, but most of that is way out west and nowhere near energy loads. The red areas you see here is geothermal. There is quite a significant geothermal resource in New South Wales. Not hot enough to generate electricity, you need about 250 degrees for that. But about a kilometre down, it's about 95 to 100 degrees centigrade. And what they do in Europe and parts of America is actually inject that energy into the thermal network. So they're gradually decarbonising their networks and turning them over to renewable fuels. And probably Denmark's in the lead in that area. Offshore, Australia has a huge renewable energy resource. The offshore wind resource alone is second largest in the world, second only to the Russian Federation. Wave and tidal, there's enough wave and tidal energy around Australia, or just the area to the south running up round from Perth up round to Victoria, New South Wales, 5 times the annual energy consumption of Australia from wave alone. And of course, non-tidal currents, the Australian East current runs along there. That's a continuous current. So trying to get that target in a local government area is quite difficult. So this is assuming that we can max out on everything. We could still only deliver 55% of the renewable electricity target within the local government area. We still have to find another 45% outside the local government area. So we developed a proximity principle. We were not going to invest or be involved with projects that were connected to the transmission network that would just simply push up people's bills. So you as a consumer, you wouldn't be too bothered about whether your electricity bill's gone up because it's a coal-fired power station or a wind farm. You're still paying high electricity bills. And so when we talk about the proximity principle, we mean connecting into the distribution network near and close to energy loads so that we don't get those losses. But importantly, following the work I did in London, there's a huge renewable gas resource in New South Wales. Not just municipal waste, but also agriculture and farming waste. And what's been going on in Europe and some states in America, farmers have been getting together into consortiums and putting their organic waste, which they'd otherwise have to pay to be taken away, and converting that into renewable gas, or bioenergy as it's sometimes called. There are some examples of that over here in Australia, but they only use that to generate electricity. What's happening in the rest of the world, they're actually using the gas to inject into the renewable gas or into the natural gas network. This shows you the resource that is established within 100 kilometres of Sydney. As I said before, municipal waste, about 35%. But things like cow pig manure, chicken manure, the waste from broadacre crops, landfill, sewage, these all go to add up to the amount of gas that would be necessary to replace natural gas by 2030. Natural gas gives us the economic construction of a network and gives us a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But we want to move towards a 100% renewable energy city. And the way that we will do that is a combination of renewable electricity and renewable gases. And just putting that together, that will deliver 31.5% reduction to add to the 32% reduction in tri-generation. That's what you can do with 100,000 tonnes of mixed waste. If you just generated electricity, you'd get no more than 30%, but the average is about 20%. Most of the energy you're generating is heat, which is just thrown away into the atmosphere like a coal-fired power station. If you're able to supply cogeneration or tri-generation on site, you can probably double that to about 60%. But if you actually move it into the gas network, and so that you're not actually trying to match time of use day energy generation consumption at a remote site, that you can get 80 to 90% of the recovery, simply because you're generating electricity, heat and cooling in the cities where it's needed and not out in some remote location. These technologies also recover water from waste. Two ways of doing it. One, using organic waste, or wet waste, so like cow or pig manure, you would use anaerobic digestion, and that would be converted into a substitute or synthetic natural gas. For drier waste, gasification, this would apply to municipal waste and broadacre crops. That generates a syngas, which can be methanized and brought up to the same standard or to look exactly the same as a synthetic natural gas. This is one of my projects in the UK. This was a remote landfill gas site, nowhere near an electrical gas grid, and they were just flaring their gas up into the atmosphere. Used small-scale liquefaction technology, and you can just see the tanker there, and that was transported into London from a distance of about 25-30 miles, and then that was regasified to supply not only cogen and trigen, but also transport. This is what they're doing in America. The US National Grid is building what they call a sustainable gas network and converting all kinds of organic waste into renewable gas. The biggest system is one in the Bronx that supplies the New York cogeneration network. That's Noontown, that's in the Bronx. That's the kind of thing we're looking at. But the world leaders are Germany. Germany, from 2006, as you probably know, they abandoned nuclear energy, so they couldn't rely on that. They can't rely on coal. And these are all policy decisions. So that has driven Germany to go into renewable gases big time. Since 2006, they have developed 8,000 renewable gas sites and 55 renewable gas grid injection systems. Currently generating 380 million cubic meters of gas, which is more than Australia's consumption. Their target is 6 billion cubic meters by 2020 and 10 billion cubic meters by 2030. They're using the gas grid for innovative things. For example, large-scale wind generation, offshore predominantly. When it's generating too much electricity, that electricity is converted into a gas and injected into the gas grid, where it can be handled much easier and provide generation into the system. That's one of the grid injection sites. It's anaerobic digestion on a farm, and the grid injection is that little thing in the corner there, that what converts the renewable gas into a synthetic natural gas and puts it into the network. The advantage of this, of course, is it overcomes the intermittency. You can use solar and wind, you can use all kinds of renewable electricity energy generation, and whether it's in a remote location, in a farm or something, or in a city where we can recover municipal waste to actually deliver that. And that can provide electricity, heat and cooling any time of the day, whether the wind is blowing, whether the sun's up or anything. It can make use of all of that and use the gas network to actually store surplus renewable electricity. Australia, interestingly, you may or may not know this, is also at the forefront of this revolution. This is a solar thermal concentrating system up at Newcastle, and this converts the solar energy into a product they call solar gas, which can be used into the gas network standalone, or even be used for commercial and industrial products, which actually currently rely on fossil fuels, and we need to think about those things. Special gases for hospitals and things like that can all be renewable. That's the local government area. I'll just finish off on what we're doing as the city itself, because one of the principles I brought with me to Sydney is that you can't expect others to do things that you're not prepared to do yourself. And so show by doing is an important principle, not only to achieve these very high level targets, but also to do it at a much more accelerated rate. So in the 3 years that I've been here, we've reduced emissions by 18%. Mainly through energy efficiency. We're just coming to the end of another building energy and water efficiency retrofit project, which will reduce our emissions by another 24%. So by the end of this year, we will have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 42% within 3 years. We've also done quite a bit on solar energy, but just small-scale projects, standalone systems. So we decided to reinvest money that was previously spent on green power into renewable energy fund to implement renewable energy in the city. And our first project that we've let there is 1.25 megawatts of solar PV, which is the largest concentration of building solar PV in Australia. We're also replacing our street lighting with LED street lights, which will reduce consumption emissions by 51% there. On tri-generation, after a 2-year-long procurement exercise, we've appointed Cogent Energy, that's owned by Origin Energy, to design, finance, build, own and operate the decentralised energy network. The energy company will own the energy centres and the energy retail outputs, but the council will own the thermal network and lease the sites. The first 5 precincts come together at around about 63.5 megawatts, and that's to be delivered by 2015. So we're already quite a way on in delivering that. At Green Square, that contract's underway at the moment. So if you go down to Green Square, you'll see a lot of constructional activity going on there. That's the old South Sydney Hospital site, which is being completely gutted, and we're putting in tri-generation, recycled water treatment, and also automated waste collection. It's just some of the examples of our solar PV projects. One of the reasons why we've done this roll across you won't be able to wander around the Sydney local government area without seeing solar PV, and that's part of getting others to kind of copy what you're doing. Railway Square interchange, replace that plastic cladding, glass cladding that you have there with solar glass PV. So not only can you provide rain cover, but also solar shading and generate solar electricity at the same time. That's the top of Town Hall House. LED street lights, if you wander around the city now, you'll see that some places have already been replaced at places like Circular Quay, George Street, some of the parks. That's a 3-year contract, and we're about 1 year into that contract. Just quickly on transport, we are trialling electric vehicles, but if you just plug electric vehicles into the grid, you're creating more pollution than you're saving. You're just moving the emissions from the tailpipe to the power station. So they are connected up and charged from our solar energy sites. The solar PV sites will actually enable us to extend the amount of public solar street charging. But also on our heavy vehicles, we've moved to diesel-electric hybrids, but we're not using diesel, we're using biodiesel. So if this all comes together and we're successful, and we've already started down the road here, what can we expect to see by 2030? Well, we could capture some of that offshore wind resource, which is going great guns in Europe. There are significant marine energy resources that can actually generate energy, probably 3 times that of a typical wind farm in terms of capacity. We would expect to see every unshaded roof to be clad with solar energy. Buildings above 100 metres will support micro wind turbines. We've done that work and we know what the wind speeds are at that height. But the real work will be going on the ground. A lot of it you probably wouldn't even see, which is across 15 precincts, tri-generation networks that will initially use natural gas, but will then switch over to renewable gas as we develop the renewable energy market. That will generate electricity, that will recover that heat, we use that for heating and hot water through a thermal reticulation network around the city, and also convert that to chilled water for air conditioning, which is why we call it tri-generation. And the city owns the streets and will be developing those networks across there, connecting buildings together in precincts, making them far more efficient than they would be if they stood on their own. I'll leave it there, and before anyone asks me for any copies of details and anything, we have a special website called Power in Sydney, Making It Happen, and we put all our documents that would otherwise not be in the public domain, including tender specification, technical specification, council reports. You don't have to write the thing down, just Google Power in Sydney, it will pop up as the first thing. Happy to answer any questions.